Karen thinks my lake is a free swimming spot, then parks her jet ski on my dock, unaware who I was. The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal-clear water of Lake Serenity, and I couldn't help but smile as I settled into my favorite rocking chair on the wraparound porch. This was my sanctuary, my slice of heaven that had been passed down through 4 generations of my family. My great-grandfather had built the original cabin here in 1923, and every morning for the past 15 years, I'd started my day exactly like this, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise from the water like ghosts dancing in the early light. The lake stretched out before me like a mirror, reflecting the towering pines that had stood sentinel here for decades. A family of loons called out across the water, their haunting melody echoing off the surrounding hills. This was why I'd left the chaos of city life behind. This was why I'd chosen to work remotely from this peaceful retreat, trading traffic jams for morning birdsong and office drama for the simple pleasure of watching nature wake up. But today, something felt different. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe the stress of the Henderson property development project I'd been managing was getting to me. As the lead environmental consultant for the region, I'd been fighting tooth and nail to protect pristine areas like this from commercial development. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using my lakeside home as a base to protect other people's natural spaces. I took a long sip of my coffee, savoring the rich blend I'd ordered from a small roastery in Vermont. The familiar ritual usually calmed my nerves, but today I felt restless. Something was off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in my morning symphony. It was faint at first, almost masked by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. But as I listened more carefully, my blood began to simmer. It was the distinct rumble of a jet ski engine, growing louder by the minute. My jaw clenched as I leaned forward in my chair. In all my years living here, I'd never heard that sound on my lake. Sure, the occasional kayaker or fisherman had wandered into my cove by mistake, but they always apologized and moved on once they realized they were on private property. This was different. This was brazen. I set my coffee mug down with more force than necessary, the ceramic clinking against the wooden table. Rising from my chair, I walked to the porch railing and squinted toward the far end of the lake. There, cutting through the morning stillness like a knife through silk, was a bright red jet ski. The rider was wearing a hot pink life jacket, and even from this distance, I could see her blonde hair whipping in the wind as she performed what looked like intentional circles and figure eights. My lake, my private, family-owned lake that had been a refuge for generations. The jet ski rider seemed to be having the time of her life, completely oblivious to the fact that she was trespassing on private property. She was laughing. I could hear her high-pitched squeals of delight carrying across the water. The carefree sound made my skin crawl. This wasn't some innocent mistake or accidental trespass. This was someone who had clearly decided that my lake was her personal playground. I watched in growing disbelief as she performed increasingly elaborate maneuvers, sending spray high into the air and disturbing the family of ducks that had been peacefully feeding near the cattails. The mother duck frantically herded her ducklings toward the safety of the reeds, their webbed feet paddling desperately to escape the chaos. But that wasn't the worst part. Oh no, the worst was yet to come. As I stood there, my knuckles white from gripping the porch railing, I watched the woman steer her jet ski directly toward my dock. Not just near it, directly toward it. She was approaching my private dock like she owned the place, like she had every right in the world to be there. My heart pounded as she pulled up alongside the weathered wooden planks that my grandfather had built with his own hands. The dock where I'd learned to fish as a child, where I'd spent countless summer evenings reading books and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The dock where my grandmother had taught me to identify different bird calls, where my father had given me advice about life and love and everything in between. And now this stranger was treating it like a public marina. She stopped the engine and grabbed onto one of the dock posts with practiced ease, as if she'd done this 100 times before. The silence that followed was deafening, not the peaceful quiet I'd been enjoying, but the tense silence of violation. She was actually tying her jet ski to my dock. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, spreading up my neck and into my face. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a complete and utter lack of respect for private property, for boundaries, for the basic courtesy that should exist between human beings. But what happened next made my blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. The woman, who I could now see was probably in her early 40s with an expensive-looking swimsuit and designer sunglasses, hopped onto my dock like she was arriving at a resort. She stretched her arms above her head, arching her back in a way that suggested she was settling in for a long visit. Then, to my absolute horror, she pulled out a large beach towel and spread it across the dock planks. She was setting up camp on my dock, on my private property. But wait, it got worse. As I watched in stunned silence, she reached into what appeared to be a waterproof bag and pulled out a portable speaker. Within seconds, loud pop music was blasting across the tranquil lake, shattering the morning peace like a sledgehammer through glass. The birds fell silent, the loons disappeared beneath the surface, and even the insects seemed to pause in their buzzing. My sanctuary, the place where I came to find peace, to reconnect with nature, to escape the madness of the modern world, had been turned into someone's personal party zone. That's when I noticed she wasn't alone. 2 other women were swimming near the dock, their voices carrying across the water as they called out to their friend. They were treating my lake like their own private swimming hole, splashing and laughing without a care in the world. One of them had even brought what looked like an inflatable flamingo, which she was now riding while sipping from what appeared to be a cocktail. I gripped the porch railing so tightly, I was surprised the wood didn't splinter. These women had turned my peaceful morning into a nightmare. They'd invaded my space, disturbed my wildlife, and were now partying on my property like they owned it. The woman on the dock had now laid down on her towel, seemingly preparing to sunbathe. She'd pulled out a magazine and was flipping through it casually, as if she didn't have a care in the world, as if she belonged there. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from pure, unadulterated rage. I'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to have my peace and quiet destroyed by some entitled woman who thought the world was her personal playground. But I also felt something else stirring inside me. A cold, calculating anger that I recognized from my professional life. The same feeling I got when developers tried to bulldoze protected wetlands, or when leaders tried to roll back environmental protections. It was the feeling of someone who had been pushed too far and was about to push back. I glanced at my watch. 7:30 a.m. The day was just beginning, and already I was dealing with trespassers who had no respect for private property or common decency. Well, they were about to learn exactly whose property they were violating. And they were about to discover that some people don't take kindly to being walked all over. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself the way my grandmother had taught me all those years ago. Pick your battles carefully, she used to say, but when you pick one, make sure you win it. This was definitely a battle worth picking. The woman on my dock adjusted her sunglasses and took what looked like a selfie with the lake in the background. My lake. My family's lake. The lake that had been our private retreat for nearly a century. Oh, she had no idea what she'd just walked into. I turned away from the railing and headed back into the cabin, my mind already formulating a plan. These women were about to get an education in property rights and common courtesy. And something told me it was going to be a lesson they'd never forget. The question was, would they learn it the easy way or the hard way? Based on what I'd observed so far, I had a feeling it was going to be the hard way. I stood up from my rocking chair, my legs feeling surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The morning air was crisp against my skin, but I could feel the heat of anger warming me from the inside out. I took a deep breath, trying to channel the calm authority I'd learned from years of dealing with difficult clients and stubborn contractors who thought they could bend environmental regulations to their will. This wasn't my first rodeo when it came to confronting people who thought rules didn't apply to them. I grabbed my lightweight jacket from the hook by the door, not because I was cold, but because it gave me something to do with my hands while I collected my thoughts. The jacket was forest green, weathered from years of outdoor work, with small patches where thorns had caught the fabric during site inspections. It was my armor in a way. The uniform of someone who spent their days protecting places like this from people, exactly like the woman currently sunbathing on my dock. My boots were sitting by the door where I'd left them the night before, still caked with mud from yesterday's hike around the property perimeter. I'd been checking for signs of erosion along the shoreline, a monthly ritual that helped me stay connected to the land my family had stewarded for generations. As I laced them up, I could hear the continued laughter and music drifting across the water, each sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The walk down to the dock usually took me about 3 minutes, following the winding path my great-grandfather had carved through the pine trees. It was a path I'd walked thousands of times, as a child chasing fireflies, as a teenager seeking solitude, as an adult finding peace after difficult days. Every step was familiar, from the exposed route that jutted up near the halfway point to the natural rock formation that marked the final turn before the shoreline came into view. But today, the familiar path felt different. Each step was purposeful, measured. I wasn't walking to the water to feed the ducks or to check the weather. I was walking into battle. As I emerged from the tree line, I got my first close-up look at the situation. The woman on my dock was even more brazen than I'd realized from my porch. She'd not only spread out her towel, but had also set up what appeared to be a small cooler and was now applying sunscreen with the leisurely pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Her jet ski was tied to my dock with professional-looking rope, suggesting this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned, premeditated. She'd come here specifically to use my property as her personal resort. Her 2 friends were still in the water, but they'd moved closer to the dock. One was floating on her back, drink in hand, while the other was taking photos with a waterproof camera. They were documenting their trespassing like it was some kind of adventure vacation. The portable speaker was even louder now that I was closer. The bass was so heavy it was vibrating the dock planks, and I could see small ripples spreading outward from where the sound waves hit the water. My grandfather's carefully constructed dock, built to last for decades with hand-selected lumber and traditional joinery techniques, was being used as a dance floor. I approached slowly, deliberately. Years of environmental consulting had taught me the importance of reading a situation before jumping in. These women were comfortable, relaxed, completely at ease. They'd been here for a while, maybe even longer than I'd realized. This wasn't a quick stop to rest or refuel. This was a full-blown occupation. The woman on the dock was wearing expensive sunglasses, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Her swimsuit was designer, and her manicured nails caught the sunlight as she turned the pages of what looked like a fashion magazine. Everything about her screamed privilege, entitlement, and the kind of wealth that made people think they could do whatever they wanted. I was about 20 feet away when I decided to announce my presence. I cleared my throat loudly, the sound cutting through the music and laughter like a warning shot. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying the authority I developed from years of telling million-dollar construction projects to halt when they violated wetland protections. "That's private property." The effect was immediate and telling. The woman on the dock looked up from her magazine with a kind of slow, deliberate movement that suggested she was annoyed by the interruption. Her friends in the water stopped their chatter and turned to look at me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild irritation. But none of them looked surprised. None of them looked guilty or embarrassed or apologetic. They looked like customers at a restaurant who'd been interrupted by someone complaining about the noise. The woman on the dock pushed her sunglasses up on top of her head, revealing perfectly made-up eyes that somehow managed to look both bored and condescending at the same time. She looked me up and down, taking in my weathered jacket, my mud-stained boots, my untamed morning hair. I could practically see her mental calculation. Middle-aged guy in work clothes, probably some kind of maintenance worker or groundskeeper. Someone she could dismiss. Someone she could ignore. Someone who didn't matter. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone suggesting that if there was a problem, it was mine, not hers. She hadn't even bothered to sit up, remaining stretched out on her towel like a cat in the sun. I took another step closer, close enough now that I could see the droplets of water on her skin, the expensive logo on her sunglasses, the way her friends were watching our interaction with the kind of interested attention people reserve for potential drama. "Yes," I said, my voice calm but firm. There's a problem. You're trespassing on private property, and I need you to leave. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. The music continued to blare from her speaker, but somehow the silence felt deafening. This was the moment of truth, the moment when she would either acknowledge her mistake and apologize, or double down on her entitlement. Based on the slow smile that spread across her face, I had a feeling I knew which way this was going to go. The woman's smile wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that said she'd dealt with people like me before and found us amusing. She finally sat up on her towel, moving with the languid grace of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders as she adjusted her position, and I noticed she was wearing jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars. "What?" she said, her voice dripping with a kind of fake innocence that immediately set my teeth on edge. She gestured broadly at the lake around us, her perfectly manicured hand sweeping through the air like she was presenting a game show prize. "It's just a lake." I didn't see any signs. Her friends in the water had moved closer now, forming a semicircle around the dock like they were preparing for a show. One of them, a redhead with an expensive-looking waterproof watch, was openly smirking. The other, a brunette with elaborately braided hair, was recording everything with her phone, holding it just above the water's surface. "Besides," the woman continued, her tone becoming more dismissive with each word, "it's not like anyone owns it." She waved her hand again, this time in a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire lake, the surrounding forest, possibly the whole world. Water is water, right? It's a natural resource. I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. This wasn't ignorance, this was willful entitlement. The kind of attitude that came from a lifetime of believing the world existed for your personal convenience. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice level despite the fire building in my chest, "someone does own it. This is private property, and I don't appreciate you using it without permission." The woman's laugh was like breaking glass. High-pitched, sharp, and completely devoid of humor. "Private property?" She looked around dramatically, as if searching for something. "Where are the signs? Where are the fences? I don't see anything that says keep out." Her red-headed friend nodded enthusiastically from the water. "Exactly. If it was really private, there would be signs everywhere. That's what my dad always says, if you can't see it, it's not really off-limits." The brunette with the phone chimed in without lowering her camera. "Plus, we're not hurting anything. We're just enjoying nature. Isn't that what lakes are for?" I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. These women weren't just trespassing. They were actively arguing that they had the right to trespass. It was like watching someone steal a car and then insist they were just borrowing it because the owner wasn't using it at the moment. "The lack of signs doesn't mean it's public property," I explained, my voice taking on the patient tone I used when dealing with particularly stubborn clients. "This entire lake, including the shoreline and the dock you're currently occupying, is privately owned. It has been for nearly a century." The woman on the dock rolled her eyes with theatrical exaggeration. "Oh, come on. A century? That's ancient history. Things change. Property changes hands. Just because someone's great-great-grandfather bought some land doesn't mean they get to keep everyone else out forever." Her casual dismissal of my family's legacy hit me like a physical blow. 4 generations of careful stewardship, of maintaining the pristine beauty of this place, of sharing it responsibly with wildlife and treating it as the sacred trust it was, and she was brushing it off like it was nothing. "Look," she continued, her voice taking on a condescending tone that suggested she was about to explain something very simple to someone very stupid. "I'm not causing any harm here. I'm just enjoying the water. My jet ski isn't damaging anything. I'm not littering. I'm not being loud." "You're playing music that can be heard half a mile away," I interrupted. She glanced at her speaker as if noticing it for the first time. "Oh, that's barely audible. Besides, music makes everything better. You should try relaxing sometime instead of going around bothering people who are just trying to have a good time." The redhead in the water laughed. "Right? Like, who complains about people enjoying themselves? It's not like we're having a rave or anything." I could feel my blood pressure, rising with each word. These women weren't just entitled, they were completely oblivious to the concept that their actions might affect anyone else. They lived in a bubble where their desire to have a good time superseded everyone else's rights. The point isn't whether you think you're causing harm, I said, my voice getting harder despite my efforts to stay calm. The point is that you're on private property without permission. That's called trespassing, and it's illegal. The woman's expression finally shifted, but not in the way I'd hoped. Instead of showing remorse or understanding, her face hardened into something ugly. The fake sweetness disappeared, replaced by the kind of cold entitlement that came from a lifetime of getting away with whatever she wanted. Illegal, she scoffed. What are you, some kind of cop? You don't look like a cop. You look like a maintenance guy or something. She looked me up and down again, her gaze lingering on my muddy boots with obvious disdain. Are you even supposed to be here? Maybe you're the one who's trespassing. Her friends erupted in laughter at this, as if she'd just delivered the comedic performance of the century. The brunette with the phone was practically bouncing in the water, and the redhead was clapping her hands like a trained seal. Oh my God, Karen, you're so right, the redhead squealed. He's probably just some groundskeeper who thinks he's important because he has keys to the maintenance shed.
Karen.
So that was her name. Somehow it fit perfectly. Exactly, Karen said, her voice dripping with superiority. I bet he doesn't even have the authority to tell us to leave. He's probably just some employee who's overstepping his bounds. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear, something much more dangerous. The kind of calm that came before a storm. These women had just made a very, very big mistake. They thought they knew who they were dealing with. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I stood there for a moment, letting their laughter wash over me like acid rain. These women had no idea what they'd just walked into. They saw my weathered jacket, my work boots, my uncombed hair, and they constructed an entire narrative about who I was and what I represented. In their minds, I was just some hired help who'd gotten too big for his britches. They couldn't have been more wrong. You know what? I said, my voice taking on the measured tone I used in courtrooms when developers tried to claim ignorance about environmental regulations. Let me educate you about a few things. Karen was still smirking, clearly enjoying what she thought was her victory. She leaned back on her towel, propping herself up on her elbows like she was settling in for entertainment. Oh, this should be good. The maintenance guy is going to give us a lecture. Her friends giggled, but I noticed something interesting. The brunette with the phone had stopped recording and was actually looking at me with something that might have been uncertainty. Maybe she was picking up on something her friends had missed. First, I continued, ignoring their mockery. Let me explain something about property law. In this state, private property extends to the high water mark. That means the shoreline, the dock, and yes, even the water itself can be privately owned. There's no requirement for signs, fences, or any other markers you might expect. Karen's smirk faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. That's ridiculous. You can own water. Water belongs to everyone. Actually, you can, I said, pulling out my phone. Would you like me to show you the deed? Or perhaps the survey maps that clearly delineate the property boundaries. I have digital copies of everything right here. The redhead in the water looked less confident now. Survey maps? Who carries around survey maps? People who know what they're talking about, I replied. People who understand that property rights aren't suggestions. They're legal obligations backed by the full force of the law. I could see doubt creeping into their expressions now, but Karen wasn't ready to back down. She sat up straighter, her voice getting sharper. Fine. Let's say you're right about the property thing. You still haven't explained why you think you have the authority to tell us to leave. Are you a cop? Are you a park ranger? What gives you the right? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when their assumptions would come crashing down around them like a house of cards. I'm glad you asked, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years dealing with people who thought money and privilege put them above the law. See, the thing is, this lake isn't just private property. It's not owned by some faceless corporation or managed by a parks department. It's not even owned by some rich family who only shows up on weekends. I took a step closer to the dock, close enough that they could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. This lake, this dock, this entire property, all 347 acres of it, belongs to me. I'm not the maintenance guy. I'm not the groundskeeper. I'm not some employee who's overstepping his authority. I paused, letting the words sink in. I'm the owner. The effect was immediate and devastating. Karen's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization that she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. You're the owner?" she stammered. "That's right," I said, my voice calm but implacable. "My great-grandfather purchased this land in 1923. My grandfather expanded the property in the 1950s. My father added the conservation easements in the 1980s to protect it from development. And I've been the legal owner for the past 15 years. The brunette with the phone was now frantically trying to back away from the dock, as if distance might somehow undo what had just happened. The redhead was looking around like she was trying to find an escape route. But Karen wasn't done fighting yet. How are we supposed to know that? There are no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate this is private property. There don't have to be, I explained patiently. But since you seem to need everything spelled out for you, let me give you some additional context. I work as an environmental consultant. I spend my days protecting places like this from people who think they can do whatever they want without consequences. I've testified in federal court about property rights and environmental protection. I've helped draft legislation that protects private landowners from exactly this kind of trespass. Karen's tan was starting to look a little green around the edges. Environmental consultant? That's right. I know every law, every regulation, every legal precedent that applies to this situation. I know exactly what constitutes trespassing, what damages can be claimed, and what penalties can be imposed. I gestured toward her jet ski. I also know that operating a motorized watercraft on private property without permission is a separate violation with its own set of penalties. The redhead was now openly trying to swim away from the dock, but she was moving slowly, like she was afraid any sudden movement might make things worse. And just so we're completely clear, I continued, I've been standing here for the past 10 minutes giving you the opportunity to do the right thing. To apologize, pack up your things, and leave quietly. But instead, you've chosen to mock me, dismiss my authority, and argue that you have the right to use my property however you see fit. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time since I'd approached the dock, she was completely speechless. Now, I said, my voice taking on the tone I used when delivering ultimatums to contractors who thought they could cut corners on environmental protections, I'm going to ask you one more time, very politely, to remove yourself and your belongings from my property. After that, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the music from her speaker seemed to fade into the background as the weight of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Karen looked at her friends, then back at me, then at her expensive jet ski tied to my dock. For the first time, I could see genuine fear in her eyes. The fear in Karen's eyes was like watching a switch flip. One moment she was the confident, entitled woman who thought the world belonged to her, and the next she was someone who had just realized she'd walked into quicksand while wearing concrete shoes. But she wasn't ready to surrender completely. Not yet. "Look," she said, her voice taking on a desperate edge that hadn't been there before, "even if you do own this place, it's not like we're criminals or something. We're just three women trying to enjoy a beautiful day on the water. Surely you can understand that." She was trying to appeal to my sympathy now, switching tactics like a leader caught in a scandal. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the kind of pleading that came from someone who suddenly realized they might actually face consequences for their actions. "We're not bad people," she continued, her voice getting higher as panic set in. "We're not vandals or troublemakers. We're just trying to have a good time. Can't you cut us some slack?" Her friends were nodding frantically now, like bobbleheads in a hurricane. The redhead had finally reached the shore and was pulling herself out of the water, her expensive watch glinting in the sunlight as she scrambled onto dry land. The brunette was still in the water but had moved to the far side of the dock, putting as much distance between herself and the conversation as possible. I watched this display of sudden humility with the same detached interest I usually reserved for studying environmental impact reports. These women had spent the last 20 minutes treating me like dirt, dismissing my authority, mocking my appearance, and arguing that they had the right to use my property however they saw fit. Now they wanted understanding. "Here's the thing, Karen," I said, letting her name roll off my tongue with just enough emphasis to let her know I'd been paying attention. "You're absolutely right about one thing. You're not criminals. You're not vandals. You're not troublemakers." I could see hope flicker in her eyes, like someone who thought they might have found a way out of the trap they'd built for themselves. "What you are," I continued, "is trespassers. And not just any trespassers. You're trespassers who have spent the last 20 minutes arguing that you have the right to trespass. You've recorded yourselves trespassing. You've invited friends to join you in trespassing. And you've been incredibly disrespectful to the property owner while doing it." The hope in her eyes died like a candle in the wind. "But there's something else you need to understand," I said, my voice taking on the tone I used when explaining complex environmental regulations to clients who thought they could find loopholes. "This isn't just about property rights. This isn't just about trespassing. This is about respect." I gestured toward the pristine lake, the untouched shoreline, the carefully maintained dock. "My family has been taking care of this place for 4 generations. We've protected it from development, preserved its natural beauty, and shared it responsibly with the wildlife that depends on it. This isn't just property to us, it's a sacred trust." Karen's face was getting paler by the minute. The expensive sunglasses that had been perched on top of her head were now forgotten, hanging askew as she struggled to process what was happening. "And you," I continued, "you came here and treated it like your personal playground. You disturbed the wildlife. You played music loud enough to be heard across the county. You tied your jet ski to a dock that's nearly a century old, and you did it all without a second thought about whether you had the right to be here." The redhead was now standing on the shore, water dripping from her designer swimsuit, looking like she wanted to disappear into the forest. The brunette had given up all pretense of swimming and was now clinging to the dock like a life preserver. "I'm the owner of this property," I said, my voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The lake, the dock, the shoreline, the forest, all of it belongs to me. Every square inch of water you've been playing in, every plank of wood you've been lying on, every breath of air you've been breathing while enjoying nature. It's all mine." Karen's mouth fell open, not in the sarcastic, exaggerated way she'd been doing before, but in genuine shock. Like someone who had just realized they'd been arguing with a judge while standing in his courtroom. You really own all of this?" she whispered. "I really own all of this," I confirmed. "I have the deeds, the survey maps, the tax records, the insurance policies, and the legal documentation to prove it. I also have the authority to have you arrested for trespassing, to confiscate your jet ski as evidence, and to pursue civil damages for the disruption you've caused." The silence that followed was profound. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. "Now," I said, my voice softening just slightly, "I'm going to give you one last chance to do the right thing. You can apologize for your behavior, pack up your belongings, and leave my property quietly. Or we can escalate this to involve law enforcement and lawyers." Karen looked at her friends, then back at me, then at the expensive jet ski that was still tied to my dock. I could see the calculations running through her head, the cost of legal fees, the embarrassment of being arrested, the potential consequences of having argued so vehemently that she had the right to be somewhere she clearly didn't belong. She started, then stopped. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. "I didn't know. I really didn't know it was yours." And there it was, the moment of truth. The moment when the mask of entitlement finally slipped away, revealing the person underneath, someone who had made a mistake and was finally ready to acknowledge it. But was it too little too late? That remained to be seen. Karen sat there on my dock, my family's dock, looking smaller than she had just minutes before. The transformation was remarkable. The confident, entitled woman who had dismissed me as some lowly maintenance worker had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely shaken. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled from the stress, and her expensive makeup couldn't hide the embarrassment burning in her cheeks. I didn't know, she repeated, her voice cracking slightly. I thought this was just a public place, like a state park or something. Her friends were equally stunned. The redhead was standing on the shore, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm morning sun, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The brunette had finally climbed out of the water and was quietly gathering her things, moving with a careful deliberation of someone who didn't want to draw any more attention to herself. We were just driving around on the water, Karen continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. We saw this beautiful cove and thought it would be perfect for a break. I swear I never would have stopped if I'd known it belonged to someone. I watched her carefully, looking for signs that this was just another manipulation, another attempt to avoid consequences. But what I saw was genuine distress, the kind of raw emotion that couldn't be faked. She was flustered, embarrassed, and completely out of her depth. The thing is, I said, my voice gentler now but still carrying authority, ignorance isn't really an excuse. When you're operating a motorized watercraft, when you're using someone else's property, the responsibility is on you to make sure you have permission to be there. Karen nodded frantically, like a student who just realized they'd failed an important test. You're absolutely right. I should have checked. I should have looked for signs or asked someone or something. She looked up at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. I'm so sorry. I really am. Her apology caught me off guard. After 20 minutes of arguing, dismissing, and mocking, I'd expected her to continue fighting until the bitter end. But this seemed genuine. This seemed real. I feel terrible, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. When you first approached us, I thought you were just some guy trying to ruin our fun. I didn't think about your rights or your property or your family's history here. I was selfish and rude, and I'm ashamed of how I acted. The redhead had finally found her voice. We all are, she said from the shore. This is beautiful property, and we had no right to be here. We're sorry for disturbing your peace. The brunette nodded in agreement as she rolled up her towel. It won't happen again. We'll make sure to research before we stop anywhere from now on. I stood there for a moment, processing this sudden shift in dynamics. These women had gone from entitled trespassers to genuinely remorseful individuals in the span of minutes. The question was, what did I do with that transformation? Part of me, the part that had been building anger for the past half hour, wanted to follow through on my threats. Call the police, press charges, make an example of them. They'd been disrespectful, dismissive, and completely oblivious to anyone's rights but their own. But another part of me recognized something I'd seen before in my professional life. Sometimes people made mistakes not out of malice, but out of genuine ignorance. Sometimes the best way to create lasting change wasn't through punishment, but through education. Well, I said finally, now you know. Karen looked up at me hopefully, like someone waiting to hear if they'd passed a test they thought they'd failed. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't make this mistake again. I continued. Not just here, but anywhere. Private property is private property, whether it's marked or not. The assumption should always be that you need permission, not that you can do whatever you want until someone tells you to stop. She nodded vigorously. Absolutely. I understand completely now. And I promise, we'll never do anything like this again. I watched as she quickly gathered her things, the expensive towel, the portable speaker that had been attacking my morning peace, the magazine that had seemed so important just minutes ago. Her movements were efficient now, purposeful. She was clearly eager to leave, to put this embarrassing encounter behind her. Thank you, she said as she untied her jet ski from my dock. Thank you for being understanding. And thank you for not calling the police. I know you had every right to. Her friends were already making their way back toward their own watercraft, which I now noticed were anchored a few hundred yards away in what was technically still my water. They'd be gone soon, and my morning peace would be restored. Just remember what you learned here today, I said as Karen climbed onto her jet ski. Respect for others' property goes a long way, and maybe next time ask first. She nodded one final time, started her engine, and pulled away from the dock. I watched as she rejoined her friends, watched as they gathered their things and prepared to leave my lake. Within minutes, they were gone, their engines fading into the distance until all that remained was the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I stood on my dock for a long moment, breathing in the returning silence. The loons called out again. The ducks emerged from their hiding spots in the reeds, and the morning mist began to lift from the water's surface. Sometimes, I reflected, people just needed a gentle reminder that respect for others' property and others' peace went a long way. And sometimes, the best victories were the ones that ended with understanding rather than punishment. My lake was quiet again. My sanctuary was restored. And hopefully, 3 women had learned a valuable lesson about assumptions, respect, and the importance of asking permission. It was, I decided, turning back toward my cabin and my waiting cup of coffee, going to be a good day after all.